Dusk Pages Presents. The Case of the Sporting Squire by Guy N. Smith. It was during 1887 that Watson obtained permission from Holmes to seek formal publication for his account of their meeting and the case known as A Study in Scarlet. It's quite likely he finalized this novel while on holiday in Scotland and submitted it to the publisher Wardlock via his agent Arthur Conan Doyle. Wardlock published it in their Beaton's Christmas Annual that December, and that was the first time that the general public came to Sherlock Holmes. It inevitably led to an upsurge in the number of requests Holmes received, and also, Holmes jokingly acknowledged, caused him to start going about his business in disguise. These include some of Holmes's best, Silver Blaze, with the curious incident of the dog in the night, The Valley of Fear, The Greek Interpreter, which is remarkable in that not until now did Watson apparently discover that Holmes had a brother, Mycroft, though we know he's aware of him earlier, and The Cardboard Box, in which Holmes reveals his ability to deduce Watson's thoughts. Another of the cases falling in this period was that of the Sporting Squire, one that Watson did not refer to, but which came to light following the investigations of that redoubtable author Guy N. Smith early in his own career when undertaking research into the theory and practice of gamekeeping. I have long learned to tolerate the varying moods of my colleague. When a working fit was upon him, nothing could exceed his energy. At other times he would lie on the sofa, scarcely moving from morning to night, his eyes closed, but I knew that he did not sleep. He either contemplated some intricate problem or else he was melancholic. But I knew better than to intrude upon his thoughts, for it would only evoke some brusque reply. For my friend could be exceedingly rude when his private musings were disturbed. It was in February 1888 that Holmes had reposed in such a fashion for 3 whole days, following upon a period when he had busied himself his various files, scribbling on a notepad, and occasionally muttering to himself. He had not eaten throughout this time, his only form of sustenance lying in that strong-smelling shag tobacco, a cloud of pipe smoke enshrouding him with the opaqueness of November fog. Poison, Watson, his sudden emergence from that apparent somnol state caused me to start involuntarily, is the device of more murderers who have escaped the gallows than any other weapon used. Poison is, in many cases, undetectable, only the symptoms of some being a guide to their identification. Often death occurs after the villain has returned to his normal routine, and the victim is diagnosed as having died from natural causes. Doubtless you, yourself, on more than one occasion, been deceived by the guile of some insidious murderer who has later reaped the rewards of his vile deed. I would hate to think so, Holmes. I confess his words brought with them a pang of guilt, a momentary feeling that I had, in some instances, neglected my duty as a doctor. It is not a comforting thought, but undoubtedly it has occurred. He regarded me with an unwavering stare. Likewise, I, on rare occasions, have overlooked some vital clue that would have led to a conviction. None of us are infallible, although, I hope, that over the past few days, I have achieved something which will make those errors, where poison is concerned, something of a rarity. That is good news indeed. I knew full well that he was about to confide in me the purpose of his recent writings and contemplations. I leaned forward expectantly. You will doubtless recall my original thesis on poisons. He became a silhouette behind a cloud of exhaled tobacco smoke, in which I examined the varieties in some detail. Yes, I had read it at his invitation some time ago. Some aspects of the paper did, indeed, throw new light on the subject. Well, I have revised and updated it, Watson. I would hope that from now on the prospective poisoner will think twice before administering some lethal dose to an unsuspecting victim. That is good news, Holmes. I have never doubted my friend's variable knowledge of botany, surpassed only by a profound understanding of chemistry. Cyanide, for example, works slowly if administered in small doses, produces symptoms of failing health, which often deceives a well-meaning doctor right up to, and beyond, the point of death. Unless, of course, he perceives a faint smell of almonds on the doomed person's breath. Now, in total contrast, he was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, followed by a knocking on the door, which bespoke an urgency that transcended the routine delivery of a letter or telegram. My colleague was instantly alert, for it was for such moments that he lived. The unexpected visitor, in a state of distress, ushered in by the long-suffering Mrs. Hudson. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes." The landlady withdrew, closed the door behind her, for she was accustomed to strange callers, day or night, and resolutely showed no surprise. "Mr. Holmes, please forgive this intrusion." Our visitor was an exceedingly attractive lady in her early 20s, long auburn hair falling about her shoulders, her expression one of acute anxiety. "Pray be seated, Miss." Holmes, like myself, had already noticed that our caller wore no wedding ring. "I am Gloria Morgan." She seated herself on the edge of the vacant chair, wrung her hands together, in obvious anguish. "Mr. Holmes, my father has my mother, a vile deed which will go both undetected and unpunished unless— Have you not informed the police, Miss Morgan?" Holmes stretched out his long legs. "Surely, that is the obvious course if you are so convinced that such a dastardly act has taken place? It would be useless, Mr. Holmes, for Dr. Lambeth is insistent that my mother died of lockjaw. But he is aging. He retires shortly, and I do not think that he wishes to put himself in the embarrassing position of accusing a prominent member of the community of such a crime on slender evidence. Please start at the very beginning, Miss Morgan." Holmes reached the old slipper off the floor by his side and proceeded to stuff the blackened bowl of his pipe with fine-cut dark tobacco. "I trust you have no objection to the smell of strong tobacco, Miss Morgan?" "Not at all." She coughed slightly, for the room was already thick with pipe smoke. "My father's Squire Royston, Morgan of Wintcombe Hall in Hampshire, is that not in the proximity of Long Parish, home of the legendary late Colonel Peter Hawker, undoubtedly one of the finest marksmen which this country has ever produced, a veteran of the Crimean War who, upon being invalided out of the army, devoted the remainder of his life to the pursuit of fur and feather." "Indeed it is." Gloria Morgan smiled wryly. "I curse him too, even though he has been dead for half a century, for it is upon him that my father has modelled himself, although I would hope that Colonel Hawker's only shortcoming was his devotion to fishing and shooting. Hawker was surely the finest game shot of all time," Sherlock Holmes answered dreamily. Not content with killing 24 snipe consecutively on one day, without missing a shot, he used to practice on bats around Long Parish Hall at dusk, and according to his books, with equal success, as my father does, especially when we have guests staying. There was no mistaking the contempt in her voice. "I digress," Holmes said. "Please continue." "As I have already said, my father has endeavored to build his own reputation upon that of Colonel Hawker's. A fine shot, an excellent fly fisherman, and a dashing horseman. Understandably, he has attracted the attention of other women. I would add, at this stage, that my parents' marriage has not been a happy one. One woman in particular is a wealthy widow by the name of Eva Dan, who currently owns Long Parish, the property most coveted by my father. There have, for some years, been whispered rumors of their relationship, and my mother has had to suffer the ignominy of it. For my sake, she clung to her marital status and rights, doubtless much to my father's chagrin. So, faced with the prospect of her remaining indefinitely at Wintcombe, and thereby depriving him of the opportunity to marry his mistress and acquire long parish, he murdered her. Can you prove it? Alas, no, but I have not a single doubt in my mind that he killed her. Then tell me everything you know, setting out your story as it happened, trying not to overlook the smallest detail, however irrelevant it may seem to you. My mother had resigned herself to living beneath the same room as my father, no matter how unpleasant that may have been. One of her interests was horticulture, and on fine days she would spend her time in the gardens. Her other love was literature. There is a small library in the hall, and after dinner each evening, she would go there to read until she retired about 10 o'clock. Lately, she took to locking herself in the library. On those occasions when my father had been drinking heavily, he would go and vent his vile temper on her. Thus, by locking the door, she ensured herself of the tranquility she required to immerse herself in her reading. And it was in the library where she met her untimely death. There was a gentleness in Sherlock Holmes's voice as he asked the question. Yes, Gloria Morgan stifled a sob. The night before last, dinner was an uneasy meal for my father, was in an uncertain temper on account of having shot badly that day. Afterwards, my mother retired to the library as was her usual routine. I am not sure of my father's movements. Possibly he went down to the gamekeeper's cottage to discuss with Randall the task of destroying a colony of moles which are currently rendering the lawns and borders an unsightly mess. And the gamekeeper? Randall is a hateful man. He reminds me of the stoats and weasels, which hang rotting and stinking on his vermin gibbet. He is the most hated man for miles around. Several cats and dogs, belonging to the villagers, have died in his traps and snares, or eaten the poison which he lays for foxes in the game preserves. The safety of his pheasants is paramount. The greater the slaughter on shooting days, the more prestigious his role becomes amongst the guests who shoot at Wincombe. A decidedly unpleasant character, by all accounts, Holmes mused, second only to my father. On the night in question, I was somewhat later retiring than usual. As I passed the library about 11 o'clock, I noticed that a light still burned beneath the door. Fearing lest my mother might have fallen asleep in her chair, or perhaps become ill, I knocked on the door. After several knockings, and receiving no response, I hastened to summon Jenkins, the butler. Jenkins forced the door open. Oh, Mr. Holmes. I reached across and patted her hand. Bravely, Gloria Morgan pulled herself together and continued her narrative. It was clear at first glance that my mother was dead. That, in itself, was awful enough, but nothing by comparison with the expression on her features and the way in which her body was twisted into an unnatural posture. Mr. Holmes, there is no doubt that my mother died in indescribable agony, unable even to call for help. You then sent for the doctor? Yes. Jenkins rode at once to the village to fetch Dr. Lambeth, who arrived soon after. And my father did not return until after the doctor's arrival. His show of distress was so shallow that the most amateurish of stage actors could have improved considerably upon his pathetic performance. Dr. Lambeth examined my mother and diagnosed that she had died of lockjaw, which seemed to satisfy my father. There would most certainly have been of the malady before death took place, he interposed. A tetanus sufferer would have experienced pain long before the final convulsions. Precisely, Holmes added. Miss Morgan, did your mother appear unwell in any way during dinner? No. Gloria Morgan dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. But of late she has suffered a loss of appetite due, I presume, to her unhappy state of mind. She ate very little on the night in question, just picked at her food. And the remains of her meal? There was a sharpness about my friend now which had been absent of late. It appeared that Miss Morgan's story had aroused his interest above the level of a routine investigation. "Oh, I know what you're thinking, Mr. Holmes." Our visitor gave a hollow laugh. The same thought crossed my mind, that some form of poison had been introduced into my mother's food. In my grief and anger, I suggested that to both Dr. Lambeth and my father. And my father laughed cruelly. "Very well," he said, leading us through to the dining room. "Just to prove to you how unfounded your stupid fears are, we will feed the remnants of your mother's meal to the dogs." We followed him outside to the kennels, where the dogs voraciously devoured those leftovers. The animals were still in excellent health when I left to catch the train to London this morning. I see. It was impossible even to guess what Sherlock Holmes was thinking as he lapsed into silence. I knew better than to inquire of him, for he would reveal them when he was ready, and not until Miss Morgan and I glanced at each other, and there was no mistaking the anguish in her eyes. She had come here with a desperate plea for help, and Sherlock Holmes was her only hope. "Watson and I will travel down to Hampshire by the first available train in the morning." Holmes had made his decision, and he knew, without asking, that I would accompany him. "It is important that I examine the scene of this untimely death without your father's knowledge, Miss Morgan. Can that be arranged?" "Most certainly." There was sheer relief in her reply. "In spite of my mother's sudden death, my father has not seen fit to cancel a day's pheasant shooting tomorrow. He will be out in the fields and coverts with his guests from around 10 in the morning until mid-afternoon." "Admirable!" Holmes snapped his long, thin fingers. "I would prefer you to return to Windcombe this afternoon, Miss Morgan. I presume that your father has no idea that you have visited me." "None whatsoever. In fact, should he find out?" I glimpsed a flicker of fear in her pale blue eyes. "I dread to think what he might do. As well as being one of the best shots in England, my father has a violent streak in him. This was evident only last winter, when he and Randall caught a poacher in the home covert, an otherwise harmless villager who only sought a pheasant for his dinner. The man was in hospital for some weeks afterwards with broken bones. Had it not been for my father's position, as well as Squire, he is chief magistrate, then I fear that the local constabulary would have barrage of assaults him. Then we shall hope to conduct our investigations undetected." Sherlock smiled as he rose to his feet. "One final question, Miss Morgan, hurtful as it may be. Your mother's body, it lies in an anteroom. The funeral has been arranged for the day after tomorrow." "Excellent, Watson," Holmes said when Gloria Morgan's receding footsteps had faded. "I shall be obliged for your professional opinion on the deceased in due course. Also, it might be advisable if you slipped your service revolver into your pocket. The man we are up against, as well as being of a violent temperament, is one of the best shots in England. We cannot afford to take any chances." A shimmering of snow sparkled across the countryside as Holmes and I traveled down to Andover on the early morning train. My companion spoke little throughout the long journey, and I knew that he was turning over in his mind everything that Miss Morgan had told us yesterday. Her story had a ring of truth to it, incredible though it seemed on reflection. Had her mother really been murdered, or was it fanciful thinking? A distraught young lady. If it was murder, then how had Violet Morgan been killed within a locked room, and the act so disguised that her death had been diagnosed as from natural causes by an experienced GP? Was Dr. Lambeth in league with Royston Morgan? Was Randall, the gamekeeper, with his store of poisons with which to kill vermin and roaming domestic pets, involved? I had enough confidence in my companion to know that if there was foul play, then he would unravel the truth. The weight of my service revolver in my overcoat pocket brought mixed feelings of comfort and unease. All too often when Holmes had instructed me to bring a pistol along, we had need of it. The man's intuition was astounding. On our arrival at Andover, we hired a carriage, Holmes instructing the driver to take us to Windcombe Hall, but to remain at a safe distance and to await our return. It was early afternoon as we walked up the winding Poplar Line Drive. In the distance, where a long, narrow wood snaked over the horizon, heard the sound of gunfire. Occasionally, we glimpsed a whirring speck that was undoubtedly a pheasant bursting from cover, a bird that had survived the line of guns, gliding on downhill to land in a field of snow-covered turnips. At least our friend, the Squire, will be kept busy for a while, Holmes remarked as we passed through a clump of rhododendrons and had our first view of the big house. I noticed that the extensive snow-covered lawns were severely disfigured by the workings of moles, something to which Miss Morgan had alluded on her visit to our rooms in Baker Street. Windcombe Hall was set in a large clearing amidst tall pines and mature shrubberies. It was clearly of Georgian origin, three-storied and with high chimneys. Undoubtedly, once it had been a magnificent country residence, but now there was evidence of loose mortar and the west wall was badly damp-stained. Which was all the more reason for Royston Morgan wanting to acquire the wealth of an eligible widow. I decided, but kept my thoughts to myself, for Holmes would not have thanked me for them. A number of carriages were parked at the rear. Undoubtedly, Squire Morgan had a full complement of sportsmen for today. Even as we mounted the wide flight of steps, the front door opened and then there stood Gloria Morgan, a long black dress accentuating her pallor. Yet in spite of her grief, her delight at seeing us was all too evident. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she cried. "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you have come. Have there been any further developments?" My companion asked as we stepped into the marble-floored hallway. "No." She shook her head. "Everything is still as it was when I left yesterday. My father is too preoccupied with his pheasant shooting to concern himself with a matter which he considers to be concluded. The library is through there." She indicated a door that was partly open. My mother, her trembling finger pointed to a closed door at the rear of the hall. "Perhaps, Watson," Holmes glanced meaningfully at myself, "you would be so kind as to take a swift professional look at the departed whilst Miss Morgan accompanies me into the library. I am curious to view a locked room where death can strike swiftly." "I will join you shortly." I lifted the lid of the polished oaken coffin and looked down upon Violet Morgan. Death, and the obvious agony that had accompanied it, had done its utmost to destroy her striking beauty. The soft lips were swollen and marked where she had bitten them, and even the passing of rigor mortis had not removed the grimace from her face. She screamed mutely up at me, for her final suffering had been terrible beyond belief. I bent over and sniffed at her mouth, but the only odor was that familiar smell of death. The palms of her hands were gouged where her fingernails had dug deep, and the mortician had been unable to straighten out her fingers fully. It was as though they were afflicted with some deformity. I checked for any signs of an open wound, a cut or scratch that might have allowed tetanus to enter her bloodstream, but there were none apart from those inflicted by herself. Certainly the corpse bore some resemblance to the final sufferings of a victim of lockjaw, but tetanus would not have struck, and without warning. Either Dr. Lambeth had never witnessed a case of lockjaw, or he was taking advantage of an easy alternative, or else he was determined to shield Squire Morgan at all costs. I was far from satisfied at what I had seen. I heard the door open and Holmes joined me. He stood there looking down upon the corpse, and I knew that his keen eyes missed nothing. Her suffering was terrible, indeed, Watson. He spoke in a low voice for fear that Gloria Morgan might overhear him. "Yes, but it was not lockjaw," I asserted. "But surely some kind of poison that is undetectable. Many poisons leave little or no trace." He bent over the corpse. You really must read my treatise on poisons, Watson. Ah! His fingers lifted up one of Violet Morgan's clawed hands, moved it so that the fingertips were exposed to view. You noticed that faint stain on the tip of the forefinger, Watson? I did not regard it as being of any significance. I somewhat abruptly, for I sensed that my companion was criticizing my professionalism. Let us return to the library. He straightened up. I followed him out into the hallway, feeling a little offended by his abruptness. Whatever the relevance of that discoloring of the deceased's fingertip, it clearly needed to be corroborated by an inspection of the scene of the crime. However, I knew better than to interrupt my colleague's train of thought. In the library, Holmes commenced a minute examination of the windows and the door. A beetle could have entered via the gap beneath the locked door. He spoke without looking round, but nothing larger than an insect. Miss Morgan informs me that her mother always kept the windows tightly shut, even in summer, as she had a phobia about night moths. But on the night in question, the temperature would have been below freezing, so no window would have been open. Anyway, he moved across to a section of bookshelving, tilted his head slightly to one side to enable him to read the lettering on the spines of the volumes. Hawker's diaries, I perceive, and also that worthy man's instructions to young sportsmen. He reached down the latter leather-bound tome and flipped the pages. Well, read, I see. As I have already told you, my father virtually worships Hawker and everything that the man stood for. There was a note of mingled repugnance and annoyance in her tone at this seeming digression from Holmes's investigations. My father's lifelong ambition was to acquire Long Parish. The place would have been a virtual shrine for him. But family finances have been dwindling for some time, and your father needed to acquire the necessary funds from other sources. Holmes remarked, I see that there is a sizable collection of medieval works. Also well read. He was examining another volume. My father was no lover of literature, Mr. Holmes. He only reads sporting books and those medieval works. Mostly reprints, as you will see, and some books appertaining to that period. Holmes's expression had changed. He was staring fixedly at the open pages of the volume in his hands. From where I stood, I was just able to read the title on the spine. Herbs and Plants of the 13th Century. Their cultivation and uses. Holmes read intently. He seemed oblivious of our presence in the room. Mr. Holmes, there was a new nervousness in Gloria Morgan's voice. The day's shooting usually concludes towards mid-afternoon, in order that the unscathed pheasants may go to roost in peace. The party will be returning shortly. I had not anticipated that your investigations would take so long. Tell me, Miss Morgan. Holmes appeared not to have heard her warning, or else he chose to ignore it. What was your mother's taste in reading? English literature. She read and reread her favorite authors. Sherlock Holmes turned his attention back to the bookshelves, his gaze searching out that section which contained works of literature. Ah! His exclamation was one of triumph as he reached down a book which protruded from one of the neat rows. This is the one which your mother was reading at the moment of her untimely death, I perceive. It was returned to its rightful place, presumably by your butler, when he tidied up the room, but, in his haste, he failed to replace it fully. Charles Dickens, I see, although I have not read his works myself. Little Dorrit, Miss Morgan answered. I know, because she mentioned it at dinner that night. Also, the volume was lying beside her. We found her. As you point out, Jenkins must have returned it to the shelves when he tidied up the room after Dr. Lambeth and the mortician had finished. Sherlock Holmes carried the volume across to the mahogany reading table. He pored over it with an intensity which I had witnessed many times in the past. Your mother showed little respect for books. He was turning the pages delicately, almost as though it was a sacrilege to touch them. From where I stood, I could see that each leaf was creased in the top right-hand corner, as if had been turned down to mark the reader's place. It was a habit which she developed in childhood, Mr. Holmes, and never relinquished, that of turning each page with a wetted forefinger. Holmes examined the pages with his lens, blew gently upon one. A faint puff of something white, it might have been dandruff from a previous reader's hair, was dislodged, fell to the floor, and became indiscernible. A cloud of what I took to be some kind of ash floated down in its wake. My colleague snapped the tome shut and, in a couple of strides, was at the window, staring out with an intensity which told me that he had spotted something which was relevant to our investigations. "The moles," he snapped. "They have made a devil of a mess of the lawns and borders. What method is being used to halt their depredations? My father has been attending to the matter himself." Gloria Morgan was visibly surprised by yet another digression. "I believe that he obtained some substance from Randall with which to kill the creatures. I recall him mentioning it to my mother a few days ago when she expressed concern at the damage done by the moles. Something which was put down the holes, I believe, although I did not take much interest at the time." "Capital!" Holmes cried. "Everything fits at last. The final piece in the jigsaw has slotted into place." "Mr. Holmes." Gloria Morgan's cry of alarm interrupted my companion's moment of exultation, and in the brief moment of silence which followed we heard the slamming of the front door, followed by heavy footfalls in the hallway. "Mr. Holmes, it is too late. My father has returned." At that very moment the library door crashed back on its hinges, and I was afforded my first view of Royston Morgan, the sporting squire of Wincombe Hall. He stood there framed in the doorway, a giant of a fellow, well over 6 feet tall and surely all of 16 stone in weight, seemingly even more immense, clad in baggy +4s and a tweed shooting jacket which strained at the shoulder seams. Silver hair spilled from beneath a wide-brimmed floppy hat. His expression was one of escalating fury, wide cheeks darkly flushed, lips bared to reveal tusk-like teeth as he removed a long black cheroot from his cruel mouth. But it was not just his size, the demoniac expression in his sunken eyes, nor his raging fury, which caused him to tremble in every limb, that had Miss Morgan cowering against the table. Rather, it was the double-barreled shotgun, which he pointed in our direction as he demanded of his daughter in slurred, stentorian tones, "Gloria, what is the meaning of this? Who are these gentlemen who have left their carriage down on the road and slunk up here like thieves intent on burgling us?" "Father." I admired her for the way in which she regained her composure and spoke with a voice that had only the slightest tremor in it. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his colleague, Dr. Watson." Sherlock Holmes. The name was uttered in a whisper which embodied both shock and anger, accompanied by an intake of breath. His gaze fastened on my companion and those cheeks became darker still. "I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes." "Holmes, the meddler, Scotland Yard's errand boy. You hear. How dare you set foot in my house uninvited?" "I invited Mr. Holmes, father." Gloria Morgan spoke coolly and looked even more radiant in her moment of defiance. "Leave my house at once." The gun barrels swung round and came to a halt, trained upon Holmes, "or I shall summon the local constabulary and have you arrested. Nobody sets foot in Wincombe Hall except at my invitation." "I rather think that it will snow again before nightfall," Sherlock Holmes remarked, as though he was totally unaware of the gun which threatened him. "Get out, perhaps," Holmes continued, undeterred. "You would be good enough to summon your local constabulary, after all, Squire Morgan, so that I may present my recent findings to them. I am now able to reveal the manner in which you murdered 2 nights ago." Morgan might have been a statue, frozen into immobility, the gun extended, one-handed. forefinger curled around the front trigger. My own hand crept into the pocket of my overcoat, gripped the butt of my revolver, my thumb easing back the hammer slowly, so that the cocking action would not click and reveal that I was armed. Indeed, I would have shot Royston Morgan through my pocket, except that I feared that the impact of the striking bullet might cause the shotgun to detonate and blast Holmes at point-blank range. That was the only reason why I did not shoot this fiend down in cold blood. This is preposterous. Morgan's lips moved at last, his denial an unconvincing whine. My dear wife died of lockjaw, caused, doubtless, by some wound whilst going about her horticultural interests. No. Holmes' gaze never wavered, not so much as a hint of fear did he show in the face of that scattergun. There is no such wound upon your wife's body. My medical colleague has already checked and informs me, with authority, that she did not die from tetanus. Rather, she died from strychnine poisoning, which is both sudden and terrible, a tiny amount of the substance, which is odorless, proving fatal. You procured the poison from Randall, your gamekeeper, for the supposed purpose of poisoning moles, but instead you used it to murder your unsuspecting wife. I used the strychnine to poison the moles in the grounds. I was heartily relieved to see those gun barrels lowered and pointing to the floor. Some of it, perhaps. Sherlock Holmes gave a short laugh. But it only required a minute quantity to bring about a terrible end for your wife and free you to marry into considerable wealth, thereby fulfilling your lifelong ambition of owning the Long Parish estate. It was a foul and cunning plan, aided by the fact that an aging medical practitioner would not even consider the possibility that the local squire might have committed murder. It's a lie, Mr. Holmes, spawned by my daughter who has hated me since childhood, and who sees a means whereby to inherit Windcombe Hall before her time. It is no lie, Squire Morgan, although certainly your own daughter had good reason to hate you. What better, you thought, than to have your wife die in a locked room, and the accusation of death by poisoning dispelled by feeding the remnants of her last meal to the dogs which showed not the slightest. You can prove nothing, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, I can. These were the moments which Sherlock Holmes enjoyed most, revealing his observations and deductions only when they were finalized beyond all possible doubt. Your own wife had developed that same habit, and the idea occurred to you that if you adhered strychnine to the top right-hand corner of the pages of whatever book she happened to be reading at the time, then it was almost certain that the poison would be conveyed. And so it was. Prove it, Morgan growled, but his tone now had an uncertainty in it. You're guessing, bluffing. No. Sherlock Holmes shook his head, the smile still lingering on his lips. Indeed, I can prove, beyond all doubt, that it was yourself who adhered strychnine to the pages of the book with moistened flour, rendering it virtually invisible against the whiteness of the paper. Having discovered which book your wife was reading, you carried out your filthy plan. Remnants of the strychnine would not, in itself, be enough to convict you. However, a small quantity of Burma cheroot ash was dislodged and showered onto the page in question, whilst you were applying the poison. Some traces remain, and I note, Squire Morgan, that you have a liking for that particular variety of strong cheroot. I am somewhat of an expert on the subject of tobacco ash, and I am able, at a glance, to differentiate between the various types. Royston Morgan's previously florid features were now deathly pale. He was shaking, not from rage this time, but from fear, because his dastardly deed had been exposed, and he would undoubtedly go to the gallows. Cowardice prevailed, but my own concern was that his shaking finger might pull upon the trigger of his shotgun, or that he might blast us all in a desperate attempt to conceal his crime. Fortunately, that was not to be. In one swift but ungainly movement, he turned, stumbled from the library, and the three of us stood listening to his shambling footsteps going back through the hall. We heard the outer door slam behind him. I drew my revolver and would have hastened after him, but Sherlock Holmes stayed me with an upraised hand. "Let him go," said he. For some moments I was bewildered, for it was not in my companion's nature to allow a cold-blooded murderer to escape. I felt Gloria Morgan's hand upon my arm, and I let her lean against me, for surely the poor girl had suffered more than enough. It was as we stood there, not knowing what Holmes intended, that we heard the simultaneous double blast of a shotgun from outside. We looked at one another, finally understanding, as the echoes rolled across the wintry landscape, slowly dying away. "It is best that way." Sherlock Holmes demonstrated a rare tenderness in his nature as he squeezed Gloria Morgan's hand. "Nothing is to be gained by bringing the matter to the attention of the authorities. Your mother is now at peace, and her murderer has fittingly paid for his crime with his life. Far better, Miss Morgan, that you make a new life for yourself, unsoiled by a scandal, would follow you for the rest of your days." Only now, with the passing of time, has Sherlock Holmes agreed to my request to record the facts concerning the case of Morgan the poisoner, as he refers to it in his own files. I read in the Daily Telegraph some months ago that Miss Gloria Morgan, formerly of Wincombe Hall in Hampshire, had married a wealthy mine owner, Africa, and had subsequently emigrated to that country. Perhaps there she will find happiness at last, and be able to cast off those dark events of that cruel winter of '88.